The thermometer nailed to the post outside Harlan Briggs's general store read 31 degrees below zero on the morning of January 14th, 1879. Elias Cutter stood on the porch of that store, steam rising from the tin cup of coffee in his bare hands, and watched the men of Dalton County file past him on their way to nowhere in particular. Their shoulders hunched against the wind, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes hollow from 3 nights without proper sleep because no fire burned hot enough, no cabin held warmth long enough, and the cold had become a living thing that crawled through every gap in every wall, in every home from here to the Montana border. Harlan Briggs pushed through his own door and stood beside Elias. The store owner's face had aged 10 years in the past week. His wife had taken ill. His youngest daughter coughed blood into her handkerchief each morning. Half his livestock had frozen standing upright in the field, and the other half would follow before February. Harlan looked at Elias Cutter, at the man's calm expression, at the way he sipped his coffee without trembling, and he said what every man in Dalton County had been thinking since the temperature dropped and stayed down. He said, "Cutter, how in God's name are you still alive?" Elias finished his coffee. He set the cup on the railing. He looked out at the frozen wasteland that had once been a thriving frontier settlement, and he allowed himself the smallest smile. He said, "You want to know how I survived, Harlan?" Harlan nodded. Elias pointed toward the eastern ridge where a shape rose against the gray sky. Round, wrapped in something that looked from this distance like the hide of some massive beast, smoke curling from a pipe at its center. He said, "That grain bin you all laughed at, that worthless cylinder of rusted steel that Cornelius Whitmore said I was a fool for claiming, that structure every man in this county mocked from the day I started, building until the day the cold came." Harlan squinted at the distant shape. Elias said, 72 degrees inside, all night, every night. My fire burns half the wood yours does, and it heats twice the space for 3 times as long. The cold has not touched me, Harlan. Not once." The men walking past had stopped. They turned. They listened. Elias Cutter descended the porch steps and stood in the street. His voice carried in the frozen air. He said, "You want to know how I survived? I survived because I listened when everyone told me I was wrong. I survived because I built what they said could not be built. I survived because Cornelius Whitmore and his sons tried to burn me out, tried to run me off, tried to take everything I had, and I refused to let them." He paused. He looked at the faces gathered around him, frost on their beards, desperation in their eyes. He said, "Cornelius Whitmore froze to death 2 nights ago in that beautiful log cabin of his, the one with the perfect corners, the one with the hand-carved door, the one he swore would stand for 100 years. His wife found him sitting at the breakfast table with his eyes open and his skin the color of ash. No one spoke. Elias said, 'His sons will be next, then half the families in this county, then the other half, unless you do what I tell you to do.'" A man named Samuel Briggs, Harlan's cousin, stepped forward. His voice cracked when he spoke. He said, "Cutter, we treated you like dirt. We stood by while Whitmore tormented you. We laughed when he called you a fool. Why would you help us?" Elias looked at Samuel for a long moment. He said, "Because I am not Cornelius Whitmore. Because letting men die to prove a point makes me no better than the man who tried to destroy me. Because there are children in those cabins, and they have done nothing wrong except be born to fathers too proud to admit they were mistaken." He turned and began walking toward the eastern ridge. He said over his shoulder, "Anyone who wants to live through this winter follows me. I will show you how to build what I built. I will show you why it works. And when spring comes, You will remember that the man you mocked is the man who saved your families. 17 men followed Elias Cutter up that ridge. By noon, they stood inside his grain bin cabin with their mouths hanging open and their frozen hands pressed against walls that radiated heat like summer stone. By nightfall, they understood everything. But understanding what Elias Cutter had built required understanding how he came to build it. And that story began 8 months earlier, in a May rainstorm, on a road that led to Dalton County from absolutely nowhere at all. Elias Cutter arrived in Dalton County on the 15th of May, 1878, with a mule, a wagon, $47 in his pocket, and nothing else in the world. The rain fell in sheets that turned the road to soup. His wagon wheels sank to the axles. His mule refused to move. He stood in that downpour for 15 minutes, soaked to the bone, before another wagon approached from the opposite direction. The driver pulled alongside and looked down at Elias with an expression that mixed pity with contempt. The driver said, "That mule is done, stranger. You might as well shoot it and walk." Elias said, "The mule is tired. A tired animal is not the same as a finished one." The driver laughed. He said, "You talk like a man who thinks he knows something." "Where are you headed?" Elias said, "Dalton County." "I heard there was land to be claimed." The driver's laughter stopped. His face changed. He said, "There is land in Dalton County, but the only land left to claim is the land nobody wants. And nobody wants it for good reason." Elias said, "What reason?" The driver leaned forward. He said, "Cornelius Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Elias then. He learned its meaning soon enough. Dalton County sat in a valley between two ridges that ran north to south for 60 miles. The valley floor was fertile. The forests on the ridges provided timber. The creek that bisected the land ran clear and cold year-round. By all measures, it should have been a prosperous settlement. But Cornelius Whitmore had arrived 15 years before anyone else. He had claimed the best land, built the largest cabin, established the only store that later became Harlan's store after Whitmore sold it to expand his holdings. He had 4 sons, each larger than the last, and together they ran the county like a private kingdom. New settlers were welcome in Dalton County as long as they understood the hierarchy. Whitmore at the top, everyone else below. Land parcels were distributed according to Whitmore's preference. Those who showed proper respect received proper treatment. Those who did not received something else entirely. Elias Cutter rode his exhausted mule into the settlement on the morning of May 16th and stopped at the land office, a single room in a building that also served as a courthouse and a jail. The clerk behind the desk looked up when Elias entered. His eyes took inventory, the worn boots, the patched coat, the stubborn set of the jaw. The clerk said, "Looking to claim land?" Elias said, "I am." The clerk pulled out a map and spread it across the desk. Most of the parcels were marked with names: the valley floor, the creek banks, the forested slopes, all claimed. The clerk pointed to a single rectangle on the eastern ridge. He said, "This is what we have. 40 acres, no water rights, no timber worth cutting. The previous owner abandoned it after 2 years." Elias studied the map. He said, "What is on the land now?" The clerk shrugged. He said, "Some fencing. A grain bin the railroad never collected. Rocks. Lots of rocks." Elias said, "I will take it." The clerk's eyebrows rose. He said, "You have not seen it." Elias said, "I have seen enough maps to know what I am looking at. The eastern ridge catches the morning sun. The slope faces away from the prevailing wind. The soil may be thin, but thin soil drains fast, and fast-draining soil does not flood. I will take it." The clerk wrote up the papers. Elias signed. The clerk took his filing fee of $12 and handed over the deed. As Elias turned to leave, the clerk said, "One more thing, stranger. Cornelius Whitmore wanted that parcel." Elias stopped. The clerk said, "He did not want it to use. He wanted it to control. Now that you have it, he will want it from you. I would advise you to sell it to him when he asks. He will offer a fair price." "Take it." Elias said, "And if I do not wish to sell?" The clerk sat back in his chair. He said, "Then I wish you luck. You will need more of it than any man I have ever met." Elias rode his mule up the eastern ridge that afternoon. The path wound through scrub brush and loose stone. The mule complained with every step, but when Elias crested the ridge and looked down at his 40 acres, he saw exactly what he had hoped to see. The grain bin stood at the center of the parcel. It was steel, cylindrical, 15 feet in diameter and 12 feet tall. The railroad had delivered it 3 years earlier for a farming operation that never materialized. Now it sat rusting in the sun, abandoned, worthless to everyone who had ever looked at it. Everyone except Elias Cutter. He dismounted and walked around the structure. He pressed his palm against the steel, warm from the afternoon sun. He looked at the circular shape. No corners, no angles, just one continuous curve. He said, to no one but his mule, "This is it. This is where I will build." The mule did not respond. Elias set up camp that night inside the grain bin itself. He cleared debris from the floor. He built a small fire in the center directly beneath the open top where rain and weather had worn a hole in the roof. The smoke rose straight up through that hole. The steel walls reflected the fire's heat back toward the center. By midnight, the temperature inside the bin was 23 degrees warmer than the air outside. Elias took note. He filed that information away. He spent the next 3 weeks surveying his land, gathering materials, and planning. The grain bin would become his home, but not in its current state. Steel alone conducted heat too fast. It would roast him in summer and freeze him in winter. He needed insulation. He needed mass. He needed something that would absorb heat during the day and release it at night. He needed firewood. The realization came to him on a June morning while he split logs for his cooking fire. A single round of pine, 18 inches in diameter, held heat for 6 hours after being pulled from the flames. Stack enough rounds together, and you had a thermal mass that functioned like a stone wall. Better than a stone wall because wood weighed less, and you could acquire it for free if you were willing to work. Elias began cutting firewood. He did not cut it to burn. He cut it to stack. His design was simple. The grain bin would serve as his inner wall. He would build a frame of posts around the bin, 3 feet out from the steel, creating a gap. He would fill that gap with firewood, stacked tight from the ground to the top of the bin. The firewood would insulate the steel. The steel would hold heat. The circular shape would eliminate cold corners where warm air stagnated and cold air pooled. It was, as far as Elias knew, a structure that had never been built before. The first man to see the design and laugh at it was Cornelius Whitmore himself. Whitmore rode up to the eastern ridge on the 4th of July, 1878, accompanied by his 2 oldest sons, Jacob and Levi. The 3 men sat on their horses and looked down at Elias, who was in the process of sinking posts into holes he had dug around the grain bin. Whitmore was a large man, 60 years old, a beard that hung to his chest, eyes the color of river mud. He sat his horse like a man who expected the world to arrange itself around his comfort. He said, "You are Cutter." Elias did not look up from his work. He said, "I am." Whitmore said, "I have been hearing stories about you. The man who paid good money for worthless land. The man who thinks he can build a house out of a grain bin." Elias drove his post into the hole. He packed dirt around it. He said, I do not think I can. I know I can. Whitmore laughed. His sons laughed with him. Whitmore said, Listen to me, Cutter. I'm going to make this simple. That land you are standing on belongs to me. It has always belonged to me. The only reason it was available for claiming is because the territorial office made a mistake. I'm here to correct that mistake. Elias straightened. He looked at Whitmore for the first time. He said, The deed is in my name. The filing is registered. The land is mine. Whitmore's smile did not waver. He said, I will give you $100. That is more than twice what you paid and more than the land is worth. Take the money. Ride out. Do not come back. Elias picked up his shovel. He walked to the next hole. He began to dig. Whitmore's smile faded. He said, You are making a mistake. Elias said, without looking up, I have made many mistakes in my life, Whitmore. Keeping what belongs to me is not one of them. Whitmore sat in silence for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the ridge. His sons followed. Jacob, the eldest, looked back over his shoulder. His expression promised violence. Elias kept digging. Word spread through Dalton County by nightfall. The new settler on the eastern ridge had refused Cornelius Whitmore. He had looked the most powerful man in the territory in the eye and told him no. Some called it brave. Most called it suicide. Harlan Briggs came up the ridge 2 days later, not as an enemy, but as a warning. He was a thin man with spectacles and a nervous way of moving, and he stood at the edge of Elias's parcel with his hands in his pockets and his eyes scanning the tree line. He said, I do not know you, Cutter, but I know Whitmore, and I am here to tell you that he will not let this stand. Elias was stacking firewood against the frame he had built around the grain bin. The structure was beginning to take shape. Vertical posts at 3-foot intervals, horizontal bracing to hold the wood in place, a gap between the stacked firewood and the steel wall where air could circulate. Elias said, What do you think he will do? Harlan said, First he will try to ruin you, poison your animals, burn your supplies, make your life so miserable that you beg him to take the land just to make it stop. If that does not work, he will use his sons. They are not subtle men. They have hurt people before, people who left the county and never came back. Elias continued stacking wood. He said, What do you advise? Harlan removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his shirt. He said, I advise you to sell. Take his money. Start somewhere else. There is no shame in living to fight another day. Elias said, Have you ever sold anything to Whitmore? Harlan went still. Elias said, Your store, the one you run in the settlement. Whitmore built it, did he not? Harlan said, He did. Elias said, And he sold it to you for a fair price. And now you pay him rent on the land it sits on, and you give him a percentage of your profits. And when he tells you to close early or open late or refuse service to someone he does not like, you do it without question. Harlan said nothing. Elias said, That is what happens when you sell to Cornelius Whitmore. You think you are buying freedom. You are buying a longer leash. I did not come to Dalton County to wear a leash. Harlan put his spectacles back on. He looked at the structure Elias was building, the circular grain bin wrapped in stacked firewood, the strange design that made no sense to anyone who saw it. He said, What is this thing you are making? Elias drove a wedge between 2 rounds of wood to tighten the stack. He said, A home. Harlan said, It does not look like any home I have ever seen. Elias said, That is because you have only seen homes that do not work, square walls, sharp corners, gaps where heat escapes and cold enters. Every cabin in this county is a fight against winter. Mine will not be. Harlan said, "How?" Elias stopped working. He gestured for Harlan to step closer. He pointed at the gap between the firewood wall and the steel grain bin. He said, 3 feet of dry wood, pine and oak, and whatever else I can cut. Each round holds heat like a stone. Stack enough of them together, and you have a wall that stays warm for 12 hours after the fire goes out. Harlan looked skeptical. He said, "Wood burns. What happens when a spark catches?" Elias said, "The wood is not inside the cabin. It is wrapped around the steel. The steel will not catch fire. The wood is packed too tight for flames to spread. And even if it burned, it would burn from the outside in, giving me time to escape." Harlan said, "And the shape? Why a circle?" Elias smiled. It was the first time Harlan had seen him smile. Elias said, "Walk into any cabin in this county. Stand in the corner. Feel the cold pooling at your ankles like water. Corners trap cold air. They create dead zones where heat cannot circulate. A circular room has no corners. The air moves in a continuous loop, carrying heat from the fire to the walls and back again." Harlan stared at the grain bin. He said, "You have thought about this." Elias said, "I have thought about little else since I was 17 years old, freezing to death in a square cabin in Minnesota, watching my father cough his lungs out because we could not keep the cold away from him." Harlan had no response to that. Elias returned to his work. He said over his shoulder, "Tell Whitmore I am not leaving. Tell him his money is worthless to me. Tell him the only way I am coming off this ridge is if he carries my body down himself." Harlan left. He delivered the message, and the retaliation began. 2 nights later, Elias woke to the sound of his mule screaming. He grabbed his rifle and ran out of the grain bin to find Jacob Whitmore standing over the animal with a knife in his hand. The mule's throat had been cut. Blood pooled in the dirt, black under the moonlight. Jacob looked up. His face held no expression. He said, "My father sends his regards." Elias raised his rifle. Jacob said, "Go ahead. Shoot me. My brothers will burn this place to the ground before sunrise, and my father will have you hanged for murder by noon." Elias kept the rifle raised, his finger on the trigger, his breath steady. Jacob wiped the knife on his pants. He walked past Elias, close enough to touch, and disappeared into the darkness. Elias buried his mule the next morning. He stood over the grave for a long time, saying nothing, and then he returned to work. The structure grew. Day by day, the firewood wall rose higher around the grain bin. Elias cut timber from the ridge, working alone, splitting each round by hand. His muscles ached. His hands blistered and bled. But the wall grew, and with each row of stacked wood, his resolve hardened. The people of Dalton County watched from a distance. Some came up the ridge to gawk. Others sent their children to spy. What they reported back made no sense. A man living inside a steel cylinder, a wall of firewood wrapped around it like the shell of some ancient creature, a design that violated every principle of construction they had ever known. They laughed. They mocked. They placed bets on how long he would last once winter came. Elias heard the laughter. He felt the mockery. And he kept building. By the end of August, the structure was nearly complete. The firewood wall stood 12 feet tall, matching the height of the grain bin. A small door had been cut into both the wood and the steel, lined up precisely, allowing entry. A chimney pipe rose. From the center of the roof, venting smoke from the fire pit Elias had constructed inside. The interior of the cabin was simple: a bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, shelves for supplies, a cast iron stove that Elias had hauled up the ridge piece by piece after trading labor for credit at Harlan's store. The floor was packed earth covered with woven rugs that Elias had made himself from scraps of fabric and grass. The first test came on a September night when the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Elias lit his stove at sundown. By midnight, the interior of the cabin held steady at 61 degrees. He used 3 logs for 12 hours of heat. He smiled in the darkness and went to sleep warm for the first time in months. The second test came in October when Levi Whitmore led 4 men up the ridge with torches. They surrounded the cabin at midnight. Levi called out for Elias to come out and face what was coming. Elias stepped through the door, with his rifle in one hand and a bucket in the other. The bucket was full of water. Levi said, "You think water will stop us?" Elias said, "Throw your torches. Watch what happens." Levi hesitated. Elias said, "The wood is stacked too tight to burn fast. The steel underneath will not catch at all. By the time your flames work through the outer layer, I will have pulled enough rounds from the opposite side to create a fire break, and I will have put a bullet through every man standing in front of me." Levi looked at his men. His men looked at the rifle in Elias's hand. The torches flickered. Elias said, "Go home. Tell your father that fire will not work. Tell him nothing will work. Tell him I am staying on this ridge until one of us is dead." Levi threw his torch on the ground. It sputtered and went out. He turned and walked down the ridge. His men followed. Elias went back inside. He added another log to the stove. He sat at his table and began writing in a journal, recording temperatures, fuel consumption, observations about the way heat moved through the circular space. He wrote, "The structure performs beyond expectations. The wood mass absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night, maintaining interior temperature with minimal fuel. The circular design eliminates cold pooling. The steel radiates warmth evenly. This is not merely a shelter. This is a system." October became November. November became December. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees below zero. The cabins in the valley began to fail. Harlan Briggs reported that his store sold every cord of firewood in stock by December 10th and could not get more. Men were burning furniture. They were burning fence posts. They were burning anything that would catch fire, and still the cold crept through the corners of their square homes and pooled around their sleeping children. The deaths began a week before Christmas. First, an elderly man named Thomas Garrett, found frozen in his bed because his fire had gone out at 3 a.m. and he was too weak to relight it. Then a family of 6 on the southern edge of the settlement, all of them discovered huddled together in the center of their cabin, as if body heat alone could save them. Then Cornelius Whitmore. Elias heard the news from Harlan, who rode up the ridge on January 12th with frost in his beard and disbelief in his eyes. Harlan said, "He is dead. Whitmore is dead. His wife found him this morning." Elias stood in the doorway of his grain bin cabin. Warm air drifted out around him. He said, "How?" Harlan said, "His cabin was beautiful, Cutter. Logs 2 feet thick, a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, windows with real glass. Everyone said it was the finest structure in the territory. And he froze to death sitting at his breakfast table because the corners of that cabin trapped cold air so effectively that no fire could warm them." Elias said nothing. Harlan said, "His sons are sick. Half the settlement is sick. The other half is burning everything they own just to survive another night. And you are standing there in your shirt sleeves like it is a spring morning." Elias stepped aside. He said, "Come inside. See for yourself." Harlan entered the grain bin cabin. He stopped 3 steps past the door. His eyes went wide. The interior was warm, not merely tolerable. Warm. Harlan removed his coat. He removed his hat. He stood in the center of the circular room and turned in a slow circle, feeling heat radiate from every direction at once. He said, "What temperature is this?" Elias pointed to a thermometer hanging on the wall. It read 71 degrees. Harlan said, "That is impossible." Elias said, "It is not impossible. It is physics. The wood mass surrounding this structure holds heat like water, holds fish. The circular shape keeps the air moving. The steel conducts warmth evenly across every surface." I have burned 4 logs since last night. 4 logs for 18 hours of heat in the worst cold this territory has ever seen. Harlan sank into one of the chairs at the table. His hands trembled, not from cold, from something else entirely. He said, "Cutter, can you teach us? Can you show us how to build this?" Elias sat across from him. He said, "That depends." Harlan said, "On what?" Elias said, "On whether you are willing to admit you were wrong. All of you. Every man who laughed. Every man who stood by while Whitmore tormented me. Every man who bet against my survival." Harlan swallowed hard. He said, "I was wrong." Elias nodded. He said, "Then yes, I can teach you, but not in time to rebuild your cabins. The ground is too frozen. The materials are not available. What I can teach you is how to survive the rest of this winter using what you already have." Harlan leaned forward. He said, "How?" Elias smiled. The same smile Harlan had seen months ago when they first discussed the design. Elias said, "You cannot rebuild your homes, but you can insulate them. Stack firewood against your walls, inside and out. Fill the corners with wood rounds where cold air pools. Use the thermal mass of the wood to stabilize your interior temperature. It will not work as well as this structure, but it will work better than what you have now." Harlan stood. He grabbed his coat. He said, "I will tell everyone. I will bring them up here tomorrow." Elias said, "Bring them today. Time matters. Every hour we wait, more people freeze." Harlan ran for the door. Elias called after him. He said, "Harlan." Harlan stopped. Elias said, "The Whitmore sons, Jacob and Levi and the others. Are they among those who need help?" Harlan hesitated. He said, "They are. Their father's cabin is failing. They will not survive the week." Elias looked out the door at the frozen landscape, the ridge, the valley, the settlement where men had mocked him and women had whispered and children had thrown stones. He said, "Bring them too." Harlan stared at him. He said, "After everything they did to you?" Elias said, "I already told you, Harlan. I am not Cornelius Whitmore. Letting men die to prove a point makes me no better than the man who tried to destroy me." Harlan nodded once. He disappeared down the ridge. Elias stood in the doorway of his grain bin cabin and watched him go. Then he turned back inside, where warmth embraced him like the memory of something he had almost forgotten. He had work to do. 17 men followed Elias Cutter up the eastern ridge that morning. By noon, 34 had arrived. By nightfall, every able-bodied person in Dalton County stood outside his grain bin cabin, breath clouding in the frozen air, waiting for instruction. Elias had prepared for this, not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way a man prepares for anything that matters. He had lived the problem. He had studied it. He had built a solution with his own hands. Now he would teach others to do the same. He stood on a stump outside his cabin door so everyone could see him. The crowd formed a half circle. Women clutched children to their chests. Men stamped their feet against the cold. In the back, barely visible, Jacob and Levi Whitmore stood with their 2 younger brothers, their faces unreadable. Elias said, "I'm going to tell you why your homes are killing you. Then I'm going to tell you how to stop it." He pointed at the grain bin behind him. He said, "This structure is round. Your cabins are square. That single difference is the reason I'm warm and you are freezing. A man near the front, a farmer named Josiah Pike, spoke up. He said, Cutter, I have lived in square cabins my whole life. My father lived in square cabins, his father before him. Are you saying everyone who ever built a home was a fool? Elias said. I am saying everyone who ever built a home did not understand how heat moves. He jumped down from the stump and walked to the edge of the crowd. He grabbed a handful of snow and packed it into a square shape in his palm. He said, Watch this. He held the square of snow up for everyone to see. Then he pressed his thumb into one of the corners. The snow cracked and fell apart. He said, Corners are weak points. They create angles where materials meet at stress. In a cabin, those corners also create dead zones where air does not circulate. Warm air rises to the ceiling and stays there. Cold air sinks to the floor and pools in the corners. Your fire heats the center of the room. The corners stay frozen. Josiah said, So what do we do? Tear down our cabins and build round ones? Elias said, No, the ground is frozen. You cannot build anything new until spring, but you can modify what you already have. He walked back to the grain bin and placed his hand on the stacked firewood that wrapped around it. He said, This wall is 3 feet thick, pine and oak and maple, stacked tight, cut in rounds 18 inches across. Each round weighs approximately 40 pounds. Each round holds heat for 6 hours, after being warmed by the fire inside. He pulled one round from the stack and held it up. He said, This is not fuel. This is insulation. The wood absorbs warmth during the day and releases it at night. When my fire dies at midnight, the walls keep radiating heat until morning. I wake up warm. You wake up frozen. A woman near the middle of the crowd raised her hand. Her name was Martha Harwell. Her husband had died the week before. Her children huddled against her legs. She said, Mr. Cutter, I cannot stack 3 feet of firewood around my cabin. I do not have that much wood. Nobody does. Elias nodded. He said, You do not need 3 feet. You need whatever you can manage. 6 inches is better than nothing. 12 inches is better than 6. Stack wood against your exterior walls as high as you can reach. Focus on the corners. Fill the corners inside your cabin with wood rounds. Stack them in the dead zones where cold air pools. He set down the round he was holding and pointed at the crowd. He said, Every cabin in this settlement has the same problem, cold corners, heat escaping through walls that have no mass. You cannot fix the walls, but you can add mass to them. Every round of wood you stack is another hour of warmth when your fire dies. A murmur passed through the crowd. People looked at each other. They looked at their hands. They looked at the grain bin cabin behind Elias and the impossible warmth radiating from its open door. Harlan Briggs stepped forward. He said, Cutter, show us. Show us exactly what to do. Elias smiled. He said, That is why you are here. He spent the next 4 hours demonstrating. He showed them how to cut rounds from logs using a cross-cut saw, keeping each round between 16 and 20 inches in diameter for optimal heat retention. He showed them how to stack the rounds in alternating patterns so they locked together and would not tumble. He showed them how to leave small gaps between rounds at the base of the wall to allow air circulation and prevent moisture buildup. He showed them how to identify the corners of their cabins where cold pooled deepest. He demonstrated the hand test, pressing a palm against the wall at floor level and comparing the temperature to chest height. Where the difference exceeded 15 degrees, insulation was critical. He explained the principle of thermal mass in language simple enough for children to understand. He said, Imagine a stone that sits in the sun all day. When the sun goes down, that stone stays warm for hours. It releases the heat it absorbed slowly over time. Wood does the same thing. Pack enough wood around your cabin, and that wood becomes a stone. It holds warmth long after your fire dies. By late afternoon, the crowd had dispersed. Teams formed. Men who had not spoken to each other in months worked side by side, cutting wood, stacking rounds, filling corners. Women organized supplies. Children carried armloads of smaller pieces to pack into gaps. Elias supervised. He walked from cabin to cabin, correcting mistakes, offering encouragement, demonstrating techniques. He answered the same questions 100 times without complaint. He showed infinite patience for people who had shown him none. As darkness fell, he found himself standing outside Samuel Briggs's cabin, watching Samuel's wife stack rounds against the eastern wall while their 3 children passed wood from a pile nearby. Samuel approached him. The man's face was drawn. Exhaustion and shame competed in his eyes. Samuel said, "Cutter, I need to say something." Elias said, "You do not need to say anything." Samuel said, "I do. I stood in Whitmore's store and laughed when he called you a fool. I bet money that you would be dead by Christmas. I told my wife that anyone who tried to live in a grain bin deserved whatever happened to him." Elias watched the children work. The smallest one, a girl no older than 5, struggled to lift a round that weighed nearly as much as she did. Her brother helped her carry it. Samuel said, "Why are you helping us? After everything we did? After everything we said? Why are you saving our lives?" Elias turned to face him. The cold had deepened. The temperature hovered near 35 below. Stars emerged overhead, sharp and brittle in the frozen sky. He said, "Because I know what it means to freeze." Samuel waited. Elias said, "I was 17 when my father died. We lived in Minnesota in a cabin not much different from yours. Square walls, sharp corners, gaps in the logs that let the wind through. Every winter was a war. Every winter we lost ground." He paused, his breath fogged in the air. He said, "The winter of 1863 was the worst anyone could remember. The temperature dropped to 42 below and stayed there for 11 days. Our fire burned every hour of every day, and still the cold crept through the corners and pooled around our beds." Samuel said nothing. Elias said, "My father developed a cough in December. By January, he could not stand without help. By February, he could not breathe without blood. The cold had gotten into his lungs. It had set up residence there. No amount of warmth could drive it out." He looked at the cabin in front of him, the rounds stacking higher against the wall, the gaps filling in, the dead zones closing. He said, "He died on the 14th of February, 1863. I held his hand while he went. His last words were an apology. He said he was sorry he could not build a house that kept us warm." Samuel's wife had stopped stacking. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching Elias, her face wet with tears that froze on her cheeks. Elias said, "I made a promise that day. I promised that I would understand how heat works. I would learn why some structures hold warmth and others do not. I would build something that no cold could penetrate, so that no family would ever suffer the way mine had suffered." He gestured at the grain bin and cabin on the ridge behind him, the smoke rising from its chimney, the warm glow visible through its small window. He said, "It took me 15 years. I studied every book I could find on the physics of heat. I talked to engineers and blacksmiths and stonemasons. I built a dozen failed structures before I understood what was wrong with all of them. And then I came here, and I found that grain bin sitting on land nobody wanted, and I knew." Samuel said, "Knew what?" Elias said, "That this was the place, that this was the moment, that everything I had learned was leading me here, to this ridge, to this winter, to this chance to prove that my father's death meant something." He turned back to Samuel. He said, I am not helping you because I am a good man. I am helping you because every life I save is a victory against the cold that killed my father. Every child who wakes up warm tomorrow is a debt paid against the debt I owe him." Samuel extended his hand. Elias looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. Samuel said, "Thank you." Elias said, "Thank me when your family survives. We have work to do." The work continued through the night. Torches burned at every cabin. The sound of sawing and stacking echoed across the valley. By dawn, every structure in Dalton County had at least 6 inches of firewood stacked against its exterior walls and wood rounds filling its interior corners. The temperature that night dropped to 38 below zero. It was the coldest reading anyone had ever recorded in the territory. Not one person died. Harlan Briggs came to Elias the next morning with a report. Cabin by cabin, family by family, the modifications had worked. Interior temperatures had risen by an average of 19 degrees. Fires that had burned out by midnight now lasted until dawn. Children who had slept in their coats now slept under single blankets. Harlan said, "Cutter, you saved us." Elias said, "I showed you what to do. You saved yourselves." Harlan said, "It amounts to the same thing." Elias shook his head. He said, "No, it does not. What I did was share knowledge. What you did was act on it. The acting is what matters. Anyone can know a thing. Knowing means nothing without doing." Harlan fell silent. He looked at the valley below, at the cabins with their new firewood walls, at the smoke rising from chimneys in the cold morning air. He said, "What happens now?" Elias said, "Now we survive the rest of the winter, and in spring we build properly." Harlan said, "Build what?" Elias said, "Homes that work, structures designed to hold heat instead of fighting it. Not everyone will want one. Not everyone will believe it matters. But those who do, I will teach. And those I teach will teach others. And eventually, maybe the knowledge will spread far enough that fewer fathers die in cold corners while their children watch." The weeks that followed tested everything Elias had built and taught. January bled into February. February brought storms that buried the settlement under 4 feet of snow. The temperature never rose above zero. Some nights it dropped past 40 below, but the cabins held. The modifications worked. The wood rounds absorbed heat and released it slowly, stabilizing temperatures through the long, dark hours. Families who had burned 12 logs a night now burned 6. Families who had burned 6 now burned 3. The firewood supply that had seemed exhausted in December now stretched toward spring. Elias made rounds every day, checking on each household, answering questions, solving problems. He became a familiar figure in the settlement, no longer mocked but welcomed, no longer an outsider but something closer to a leader. The only exception was the Whitmore cabin. Jacob and Levi and their 2 younger brothers, Matthew and John, had followed the instructions. They had stacked wood around their father's beautiful cabin. They had filled the corners with rounds. They had done everything Elias had demonstrated, but they had done it in silence. They had not spoken to him. They had not thanked him. And when he approached their cabin to check on their progress, they turned their backs and walked inside. Elias understood. Gratitude was difficult for men who had been raised to dominate. Accepting help from someone they had tormented required a humility they did not possess. He let them be. He did not force the issue. He trusted that time would do what confrontation could not. He was wrong. The confrontation came on the night of February 20th, 1879, 6 weeks before spring. A warm front had moved in from the south, raising temperatures to a balmy 2 degrees above zero. The relief was palpable. People emerged from their cabins for the first time in days. They gathered in the settlement's common area to share food and stories, and the simple joy of standing upright without shivering. Elias attended the gathering at Harlan's invitation. He stood at the edge of the crowd, sipping coffee, watching the community he had helped save celebrate its survival. Jacob Whitmore emerged from the darkness and walked straight toward him. The conversation stopped. The laughter died. Everyone turned to watch. Jacob stopped 3 feet from Elias. His brothers flanked him. Matthew and John held axe handles. Levi held a length of chain. Jacob said, "Cutter." Elias said, "Jacob." Jacob said, "My father is dead because of you." Elias did not move. He said, "Your father is dead because his cabin had cold corners, and he did not know how to fix them." Jacob's face twisted. He said, "My father built the finest cabin in this territory. He built it with his own hands. He survived 30 winters in that cabin. And then you came along with your grain bin and your firewood walls and your arrogant certainty, and you made him look like a fool." Elias said, "I made him look like nothing. I built what I built." He died because he was too proud to learn from someone he considered beneath him. That is not my fault. That is his. Jacob stepped closer. His breath fogged between them. He said, "My father is dead. Someone has to pay for that." Elias set down his coffee cup. He said, "Is that what you believe, Jacob? That death requires payment? That every loss demands revenge?" Jacob said, "That is what I know." Elias looked at the brothers, at the axe handles, at the chain. He looked at the crowd gathered around them, frozen in fear, unwilling to intervene. He said, "Your father tried to drive me off my land. He sent you to kill my mule. He sent Levi to burn my cabin. He did everything in his power to destroy me, and I survived. And when the cold came, I did not let you freeze, even though you had given me every reason to want you dead." Jacob said, "That changes nothing." Elias said, "It changes everything. I had the right to let you die. I chose not to. That choice cost me nothing but pride. And now you stand here, alive because of that choice, telling me someone has to pay for your father's death." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He said, "Pay attention, Jacob. I am going to explain something your father never understood, and I am only going to explain it once." The crowd held its breath. Elias said, "Coal does not care about pride. It does not care about power. It does not care about who your father was or how much land you own or how many men fear your name. Cold is a force of nature. It kills without malice and without mercy. The only way to survive it is to understand it. And the only way to understand it is to admit that you do not know everything." He pointed at the Whitmore brothers. He said, "Your father built a cabin that looked magnificent and performed terribly. He was too proud to question his own work, too proud to learn from others, too proud to admit that a man living in a grain bin might know something he did not. That pride killed him. And if you carry that same pride into the rest of your lives, it will kill you." 2. Jacob's hand moved toward the knife at his belt. Elias did not flinch. He said, "Go ahead. Kill me. Burn my cabin. Destroy everything I have built. And next winter, when the cold comes back, who will teach you how to survive it? Who will show your children how to stack wood and fill corners and understand the physics of heat? You?" Jacob's hand stopped. Elias said, "I am the only person in this territory who knows how to build structures that hold warmth efficiently. Kill me, and that knowledge dies with me. Your revenge will cost you your future. Is that trade worth it?" The silence stretched. Seconds became minutes. The crowd watched. The fire crackled in its pit. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Jacob Whitmore lowered his hand. His brothers shifted behind him. Levi dropped the chain. Matthew and John let the axe handles fall to their sides. Jacob said, "This is not over, Cutter." Elias said, "Yes, it is. Your father's dead. Nothing you do will bring him back. The only question that matters now is what kind of man you choose to become in his absence. You can spend the rest of your life seeking revenge for a death that was no one's fault but his own, or you can learn from his mistake and build something better." He picked up his coffee cup. He said, "The choice is yours. I will not make it for you." He turned and walked back toward the ridge. No one followed him. The winter ended 6 weeks later. The snow melted. The ground thawed. The temperature rose above freezing and stayed there. The people of Dalton County emerged from their modified cabins, blinking in the spring sunlight, alive. Elias Cutter stood on his ridge and watched them gather in the fields below. They embraced each other. They wept. They laughed. They celebrated a survival that had seemed impossible 3 months earlier. Harlan Briggs climbed the ridge to stand beside him. Harlan said, 63 people lived in this settlement when winter began. 61 are still alive." Elias said, "Who did we lose?" Harlan said, "Cornelius Whitmore and Thomas Garrett, both before you taught us what to do." Elias nodded slowly. He said, 61 out of 63. Better than I hoped." Harlan turned to face him. He said, "Cutter, I have been talking with the others. We want you to stay. We want you to teach us how to build properly. We want to hire you to design structures that work the way yours works." Elias looked at the grain bin cabin behind him. The firewood wall that had kept him alive through the worst winter in territorial memory. The circular shape that eliminated cold corners. The simple, elegant design that had been mocked and dismissed and ultimately validated by the only judge that mattered. He said, "I will stay on one condition." Harlan said, "Name it." Elias said, "No one owns me. I teach because I choose to teach. I build because I choose to build. I am not your employee. I am your neighbor. When I give advice, you are free to ignore it. When I make suggestions, you're free to refuse them. I will not become another Cornelius Whitmore, telling people what to do because I know better." Harlan smiled. He said, "That sounds fair." Elias said, "One more thing." Harlan waited. Elias said, "The Whitmore brothers, they need work. They need purpose. They need something to do with their hands besides plan revenge that will never satisfy them." Harlan's smile faded. He said, "You want me to hire the men who tried to kill you?" Elias said, "I want you to offer them a choice. They can work alongside everyone else, building structures that save lives, contributing to something larger than their father's legacy, or they can spend the rest of their years nursing hatred and watching the world move on without them." Harlan said, "And if they choose hatred?" Elias shrugged. He said, "Then at least we offered. The choice, like everything else, is theirs." Spring became summer. Summer became fall. The people of Dalton County built 17 new structures, using the principles Elias had taught them. Some were circular, like his grain bin cabin. Others were square but insulated properly, with thick firewood walls and rounded interior corners that prevented cold from pooling. Elias supervised every construction. He tested every design. He documented every measurement and every temperature reading in journals that would eventually fill 3 shelves in Harlan's store. The Whitmore brothers accepted the offer. Reluctantly at first, then with increasing commitment. Jacob proved particularly adept at cutting and stacking wood. His strength, which had once been used to intimidate, became an asset in construction. Levi developed a talent for design, suggesting modifications to Elias's original plans that improved efficiency. By the time the second winter arrived, Dalton County was prepared. The temperature dropped. The snow fell. The cold crept across the valley like a predator seeking weakness. It found none. Every structure held. Every family stayed warm. The firewood supply, which had been carefully managed and properly stored, lasted through February with reserves to spare. The death count for the winter of 1879 to 1880 was 0. Elias Cutter stood on his ridge on the first day of spring and watched the settlement below come alive. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children ran in the muddy streets. Men and women emerged to begin planting, their faces healthy, their bodies strong. Harlan climbed the ridge for the last time as a supplicant. He said, "Cutter, we did it. 2 winters, no deaths. Your methods work." Elias said, "The methods have always worked. People just needed to see proof." Harlan said, "What will you do now?" Elias considered the question. He looked at his grain bin cabin, at the firewood wall, at the structure that had started as a mockery and become a monument. He said, "I will write it down. Everything I know about heat and insulation and thermal mass and circular design, I will write it in language anyone can understand. And then I will send copies to every settlement and town and city I can reach." Harlan said, "Why?" Elias said, "Because my father died in a cold corner, and somewhere right now another father is dying the same way. Because knowledge that stays in one place helps no one. Because the whole point of surviving is passing on what you learned so others can survive too." He turned to face Harlan. He said, "This settlement will be fine. You know what to do. You have the skills and the materials and the experience. But there are thousands of places that do not. Thousands of families building square cabins with sharp corners because they do not know any better. They need what I have. I intend to give it to them." Harlan extended his hand. Elias took it. Harlan said, "Thank you, Cutter, for everything." Elias said, "Thank me by teaching others. Thank me by spreading what you have learned. Thank me by making sure no one in this valley ever freezes again." He walked back into his grain bin cabin. He sat at his table. He opened a fresh journal and began to write. The first line read, "On the subject of heat retention in frontier structures, with particular attention to the elimination of cold corners and the application of thermal mass principles." He wrote for 6 months. He produced 300 pages of instruction, illustration, and explanation. He sent copies to territorial governors, to railroad companies, to newspapers, to anyone who might read and share the information. Some copies disappeared, some were ignored, but some reached people who understood. A settlement in Dakota built 6 circular cabins using his designs. A town in Nebraska modified its existing structures with firewood walls. A mining camp in Wyoming survived a brutal winter that killed half the horses but none of the men. Word spread. The methods worked. The man who had been mocked for living in a grain bin became known across the frontier as someone who understood something others did not. Elias Cutter never sought credit. He never demanded payment. He never built a legacy in his own name. But in the spring of 1882, a letter arrived at Harlan's store addressed to him. The return address listed a small town in Minnesota, a place Elias had not seen in nearly 20 years. He opened the letter and read it twice before he understood what it meant. The letter came from a woman named Sarah Halverson. She explained that her husband had built their cabin using instructions from a document that had circulated through their community. The document described a method of insulation using stacked firewood and the elimination of cold corners through rounded interior construction. The method had saved her family during a winter that killed 11 people in neighboring settlements. She wrote, "I do not know who created this document, but I wanted the author to know that my children are alive because of it. My husband is alive. I am alive. Whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you. Elias set down the letter. He looked out the window of his grain bin cabin at the ridge where he had built his life. He thought about his father, dying in a cold corner 36 years earlier. He thought about the promise he had made to understand heat and to build something better. He thought about the men who had mocked him, and the men who had threatened him, and the men who had ultimately learned from him. He thought about 61 people surviving a winter that should have killed them. He picked up his pen and wrote a response. He wrote, "Dear Mrs. Halverson, my name is Elias Cutter. I'm glad my work reached you. I'm glad your family is safe. If you would like to learn more, I have enclosed additional instructions. Share them with anyone who will listen. The cold is patient. It will always return. The only way to defeat it is to be ready." He sealed the letter and walked down the ridge to post it at Harlan's store. The store was busy. Farmers buying seed, ranchers selling cattle, women shopping for fabric, and children stealing candy when their mothers looked away. Elias handed the letter to Harlan and asked him to send it with the next mail run. Harlan took the letter and looked at the address. He said, "Minnesota. Long way from here." Elias said, "Not as far as it used to be." Harlan smiled. He said, "You know something, Cutter? When you first came to this county, I thought you were a fool. I thought Whitmore was right about you. I thought you would be dead before winter and forgotten before spring." Elias said, "What do you think now?" Harlan looked out the window at the settlement, at the structures Elias had helped build, at the people who were alive because a man in a grain bin had refused to die. He said, "I think you proved us all wrong, and I think that might be the most important thing anyone has ever done in this territory." Elias nodded once. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. He looked back at Harlan. He said, "Remember what I told you about cold corners?" Harlan said, "I remember," Elias said. "The same principle applies to people. Sharp angles trap bitterness. Rounded edges let it flow away. Be patient with those who mock you. They may yet become the ones who save you." He walked out into the spring sunlight. The valley spread before him. The ridge rose behind him. The grain bin cabin waited at the top, warm and solid and permanent. He climbed toward home,